Start with the land acknowledgement. Indigenous land acknowledgement is an effort to recognize the indigenous past, present, and future of a particular location and to understand our own place within that relationship. Going beyond land acknowledgement is acknowledging Canada's history with colonialism. Indigenous people, including First Nations and Inuit people, have called this territory home for well over 500 years. We live and work on unceded ancestral land, in other words, stolen land. Instead of acknowledging the land we are on, I invite you to create an action plan that highlights concrete steps to support Indigenous people. In your orange shirts made by Indigenous people, or do the profits from that shirt directly support Indigenous communities? I invite you to think of the colonial privileges and complicities that we all carry. There are ways to break down systematic and institutional barriers, and it begins with those with privilege using their access as a stepping stone to do their own learning and share those resources with others. Territorial acknowledgements are one small part of disrupting and dismantling colonial structures. Land acknowledgements are just one small step we can take to honor that healing. They're not meant to erase oppression. It's going to take many steps, walking together, but it's important to remember that every step counts. Thank you. And now I will invite Tata Bartolo. He is a Maya Quiché elder, survivor of the repression in the 1950s by United Fruit Company in sector Tiquizate Escuintla, Ishimuleo, Guatemala, in Cachiquel Maya. Welcome, Tata Bartolo.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. My presence here is to say good night. I do not speak English. My mother's tongue is Maya Quiché. That's my identity in all the world.
I do not speak English, but I speak Spanish and my Mayan language, and I will do this prayer in Spanish.
My presence at this moment, all my brothers, my Guatemalan brothers and sisters asked me to do a Mayan preach for the opening of this event, in this meeting. Now, if you want to listen about the history of Guatemala or what has happened, so my work is to welcome you and to open the ceremony in the name of the Creator, the giver of life, the one we call Ahau, the owner of the whole universe, the main cause, the unity of diversity. It's God, Jehovah, Yahweh, but in the Mayan Quiché language we call it Kawawil. Double look, double presence, omnipresent, omni-feeling. It's everywhere. Everywhere has the name. It doesn't have the name of God. So the reverence that we do to the Creator, it is like this. Not both kneels, because both knees means it's kneeling down, that we are kneeling for 532 years. This heritage, it's from our ancestors. This is the way of how the ancestors, how the Balam sits. Balam means jaguar. Pitol Tzakol. Xpayakok Ixmucane. Alom Cajolom. Tepeu Cucumats. We are present here in our presence, and the positive energy is within us. I'm gonna ask from the bottom of my heart, with lots of affection, with all my will, that the peace is with everyone, with us, that our thoughts, our words, we ask to stop the war, to stop the injustices, to stop healing, to stop harming Mother Earth, because it is our mother. It is precisely el Tikabawil, the double look, the double presence that is present within the flowers, within the human mind. I give you thanks forever. I hope that our wishes, our prayers will go far, far away. Thank you very much, Celestial Father, giver of the children, giver of the boys and girls, the water, the fire, of all the elements of which we are part of, as the microcosmos or the small cosmos within the bigger human being of this earth. That beauty, we belong to the microcosmos because we have a body, we have cells, we have a system as the cosmic system. So tonight I'm gonna ask you to please, just for a few seconds, to close our eyes and ask to Mother Earth at this moment, at this very moment. She's giving us a eternal journey. She's running 65 kilometers per second, and tomorrow she will be visiting another beings within the same planet, within the same earth. Let's think in Bitol, in Tzakol, Bitol, the builder, Tzakol, the engineer who drew the universe. We are participants of that beauty. Within the cosmos, there are many worlds moving, stars, suns die. They are born, they are dying, just like us, that we born and die, and we do not crash with each other. Because there is an order, there is a law, and the law is the love. Love is given by the Creator. So I, with lots of love, lots of affection, simply I want to bring those prayers to honor and glorify Bitol, Tzakol, and Kamawil. Thank you very much for listening to me. I have no other words that the Creator gives us of blessings that fills us of good energy so that we can understand ourselves and we can understand not more mining. A lot of animals are dying in the shores because they are owners of the seas, but I saw a whale, a big whale. The government, I'm not sure if it was the government, but they had to bring some machinery to move a dead whale. That's our work, to defend the land, because we belong to the land. We are sons and daughters of the land. To take care of the water, to take care of the fire, to take care of the wind. AP, ahau, ahau, ahau. Thank you very much. To see where the land is taking us. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
In our program now we have Spin Poeta. He's an arts educator with nearly 2 decades of experience. He is the proprietor of One Mic Educators, an arts education enterprise that funds the LA3 Raza Open Mic series, bringing together featured artists from Latin America, African diaspora communities, and indigenous nations. A Guatemalan poet, slam poetry champ, who builds up racialized youth who are gifted because their voices matter. Welcome, Spin.
Okay, esto ya parece como que un funeral.
This looks like a funeral. Please, some applauses, please. Our people, it's really in a party because
Our people back home are active, they're cheerful, they're loud, they're dancing back home. So we gotta bring life into this. I'm going to do 2 poems, one in Spanish, one in English. I'll start in Spanish. And before I do, some context, I was born and raised. I had to leave I was told on the day of my 11th birthday that we would become refugees. We had to leave. My mother's best friend was a doctor with the guerrillas. She would treat combatants in the city. She was disappeared by the military. She was on the national softball team. We had a police car in our corner watching our every move, and we had to leave. I also have family from Tacisco. So having Arévalo right now is such an incredible honor. My uncles back home took me to Juan Jose Arévalo's house, and this is a special moment for me. So I'm gonna share a poem I wrote many years ago that I am so happy to be able to name Arévalo and mention Guatemala as a revolutionary president-elect in it. It is in Spanish, my apologies, but the following one will be in English.
for all the community that we have had to leave or that we have suffered the life of a refugee, it's something that I wrote about 10 years ago. It was in Chavez time, it was in the times of Evo Morales. It was a big pride for Latin American. I had the honor to be a international observer in the FMLN when they won the first time in El Salvador. We were afraid to even speak about our political views, so it is an honor to me to share this poem with you guys in Spanish, and the next one is in English.
Dante Antonio Ábalos era mi mejor amigo desde mi niñez. Antes de que tuve que salir refugiado o exiliado con estrés. Guerra sucia en Guatemala, ya tú sabes cómo es. Allí no es bueno el que ayuda, sino el que no jode, y es un crimen apoyar al pueblo que es pobre. Rompí amistades, familiares y raíces. Les dije mucha, miren más allá de sus narices. Aquí no hay justicia, la indiferencia droga y a todo el mundo envicia. Codicia del rico contra el que vive humilde. Guerrilla del pobre que lucha por ser libre. Y mi bendita madre que se atreve a unirse a la lucha por justicia de un pueblo marginal. En esos tiempos el alfabetismo era un acto criminal, el sindicalismo muchas veces mortal, y la cooperativa fue el punto final de mi residencia en mi patria maternal. Convertido en refugiado, un 15 de febrero salimos deprisa sin comer desayuno. Yo fui alumno de varias escuelas primarias en Guatemala, Costa Rica, Inglaterra y Canadá. La injusticia social que me trajo para acá me impulsó a deshacer con Dante la amistad. Finalmente comprendí la triste realidad que vive el pueblo indígena en su patria ancestral. Rompí la amistad por cuestiones ideológicas, su forma de pensar ya no tenía lógica y me envolvió a mí la soledad muy tóxica, refugiado, sin amigos, solo convicción, exiliado yo fui pero con una visión, yo debía combatir toda forma de opresión, solo blancos en la tele y comprendí que mi misión dirigía la poesía que escribía y algún día derrotaría la tiranía de la CIA que hería la alegría de los niños inocentes, pueblos oprimidos y varios dirigentes con mis rimas insurgentes que me nacen del alba y liberan del cautiverio al que busca la calma. Por todo el hemisferio derrotaremos al imperio como lo hizo el alba. El pueblo indígena resiste por siempre la opresión, pero casi nunca existe en la televisión. Y si lo hace, consiste en una pinche atracción para los dólares de turista en su desgraciada nación. Hasta que un glorioso día, Evo Morales ganó su elección. Y Hugo Rafael Chávez Frías ganó su elección. Y Arévalo, presidente electo, ganó su elección. Y a los mulas de mis amigos no les queda otra opción que aceptar que en nuestras tierras aún clamamos por la revolución. Can't translate that shit. Gracias. This next poem, I actually presented it at a CBC. There was a competition, and I had been hired to deliver a poem. Initially, the theme was belonging, and I wrote this heartwarming poem about this immigrant that found belonging in Canada, and it was like very safe. So they invited me back. And the time they invited me back, Israel was doing what it's always done to Palestine, genocide. And there was a reclamation taking place in Ganestado in Six Nations territory, referred to as Caledonia. And all this within the context of them calling me and asking me to write a poem and telling me the theme was made in Canada. And I was like, are these people crazy? What am I gonna, like, oh, thank you, Canada, I made it? Like, it's all hell is breaking loose right now. So I wrote a poem, and I didn't win the competition. There was a recount. That was George Bush had just won by a recount. And so I believe what happened is this poem I'm going to share, they were like, there's no way in hell this is going to get on air. So it's not the Made in Canada poem. This is a poem called Nowhere to Aim, and I had to adapt it with all the sad realities of the residential schools and all the truths that we've known for decades, but the proof that started coming out. I had the honor to be at Metropolitan University when the statue was taken down, and I didn't do it. You never know who's in the audience. I didn't do it, but I had the honor to be there and take a beautiful picture with my foot. This motherfucker said. So so I adapted the poem, and I want to share that today because I believe the fighting spirit of our people never dies. And we're in the era of ideas, and ideas is what's going to get us through. So this is the poem. I'm used to being out in the streets kicking poems. It's only for the youth that my thugs have been flowing. The pain of my people doesn't seem to stop growing. Rich white men and the seeds that have been sowing are starting to reap all of this hatred, created inside of the kids that's butt naked, watching you desecrate our lands that are sacred. U.S. pilots in Panama and crooked cops in Minnesota will always be hated. Can't you see what they did, all the lives that they killed with empty glares on their faces and bombs on marketplaces? Desde el 23 de enero hasta Soweto, this whole world is a ghetto. I want to slap these generals with their own army medals and the occupation. Palestine to Puerto Rico and get the Clintons out of Haiti. Circumstances made me militant and angry, ancestrally deep like the waters of Euphrates. These colonizers killed indigenous babies with their Bibles lately, shady residential school truths unearthed as more bodies get found underground, so we got their statues tumbling down. They don't want us around. We got these devils tripping. I once read in a book that in Puerto Rico, the Americans made it so that 66% of women can't even have children. But they're multiplying. My peoples are defiant. Mess with us and we're bound to start a riot. Nunca dejaremos la batalla. Nos cubren la boca, pero nunca nos callan. Luchamos por siempre como los ancestros mayas, because we've come to the point of no return and we can never go back. And we're warring with righteous anger like Palestine under attack. Her borders invaded, so she has a right to bust back. Politically, this refugee be ever ready to clap. Any fool dismissing the pain caused in my region. America Latina, I see your veins just open and bleeding. And don't get it twisted, I never called the rich white man a demon, but he did have some evil floating around in his semen when he created this capitalism that's been killing our peoples, torturing indigenous peasants under the presence of steeples. Civilization brought to Africa through a wretched gun's barrel. Sindicalistas colombianos have been living in peril. Long before COVID was a word in the media's mouth, genocide was the only pandemic that was taking us out. And these rich folk don't know what we're so angry about. The love for my people is hurting, and I'm left brokenhearted because they love to call themselves Spanish, forgetting how Latin America started. Never have I seen a people more in love with their colonizers. ¿Qué diablo les pasa? Casarte con una blanca para mejorar la raza? Eso es puro racismo. Stop it. My people's convictions compromised and corrupted. Co-opted by the dollars that have been polluting this earth. They love to criticize, call me a racist in reverse because I attack white supremacy, but you have to figure what their racism did to the ones they called. So work it out. I got no time for more history lessons, and don't get offended about this historical presence. Know that I was taught about U.S. Army atrocities and generosities not possibly solving the causes of poverty. Our lands have been stolen by multinational companies. I accompany these words through garbage dumps in the slums, where orphan street infants were turned into bums and then shot for no reason, and teaching women to read landed mi tia in prison. This is the point of no return, and I'm not going back. And spitting poems doesn't make me a non-violent cat. I just happen to know where you should be aiming that gap. So watch your mouth, you racist donkeys, before it lands you on your back. I just want to thank Vilma for the invitation, my dear. It's been an honor to be with you. Poeta on Instagram, or Educators One Mic on Instagram. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for putting this spark of cheerfulness here too. Now, next we have Pedro Montejo. I don't have a bio about him. All I can say is that he's a very humble Guatemalan giant man. It's multi-skillful, and he's going to share some of his talents here with us tonight. Thank you, Pedro.
Bueno, como que ya empezó la fiesta acá, ¿no? Muy triste, ¿no? Okay, the party just started. ¿Cómo están? How is everybody doing? Well, I would like to tell the story before I start my first song. When I came to Canada, 1986, a lady from Canadian immigration asked me, "Oh, Pedro, why are you leaving Guatemala? What were you involved in some social movement or anything like that?" And then I looked exactly directed to her eyes, and I said, "Yes, I did. Yes, I did." And she said, "Do you think you want to continue doing that work in Canada?" And then I took my time and I said, "I'm going to do that at the last minute of my life, anywhere I'm going to be. I'm going to support the struggle of my people for freedom and democracy wherever I'm going to be." So, and she didn't say anything. So I carried my marimba, the little one from Mexico, with my wife and my kids. Went to Alberta and met some Mapuche people from Chile. They were so nice, Salvadorian everywhere. So we did a group. We organized a band in order to tell what's going on in Guatemala. And I wrote this song. Then, and I want to dedicate it to my people, my brothers and sisters in Guatemala now that are resisting that are struggling for freedom and democracy. It's called, I name it Adelante Guatemala. Todo ese tiempo que ha pasado de injusticia y desigualdad, de un pueblo hambriento y masacrado, será el camino hacia la libertad. Toda la sangre de nuestros mártires que se ha regado en todos los campos, fueron manos que disfrutaron la dicha justa de un pueblo entero que busca igualdad. Es Guatemala que hoy ha despertado y forja su lucha por la libertad, y desde el campo hasta las ciudades, luchas populares se dejan sentir. Es Guatemala, mi Guatemala. Ya se anunció que ese tiempo de injusticia y de corrupción estará pronto terminando. Un tiempo nuevo está por venir, con sangre pura de masacrados. Ya se han regado todos los surcos, las milpas que ahí brotaron dieron mazorcas que hoy alimentan la lucha popular. Es Guatemala que hoy ha despertado y forja su lucha por la libertad. Y desde el campo hasta las ciudades, luchas populares se dejan sentir. Es Guatemala, mi Guatemala. Here I am 37 years ago, 37 years from now, and many of my friends here were same thing happened. But let's not forget about our people. And you know, music has always been working together with any movement of struggle for justice, for democracy, to protect the rivers, to protect the land, to protect the water, the oceans, and everything. Music always been there. Music is strength. La música es fuerza. And back in 1970s, I was a little young boy, and I heard the music of this beautiful band from Venezuela. Beautiful music. All the lyrics were genuine. They always tell the truth, what's happening all Latin America. And for us, the young people then, encourage us to continue to struggle until now. Thank you for the solidarity. Thank you for you guys are coming here. And thank you for this beautiful band, Los Guaraguao. And this is a song that I'm going to do. Hermano, dame tu mano. Vamos juntos a buscar una casa pequeñita que se llama libertad. Esta es la hora primera, este es el justo lugar. Abre la puerta que afuera la tierra no aguanta más. Sigue adelante, hermano, que es tu tierra la que espera, sin distancia ni frontera, poniendo en alto la mano, sin distancia ni frontera, que es tu tierra la que espera. El clamor americano levanta en todo las manos al Señor de las cadenas. Éntrale a la marcha, éntrale al tambor, éntrale que traigo pueblo en mi voz. Éntrale a la marcha, éntrale al tambor, éntrale que traigo pueblo en mi voz. Hermano, dame tu pan, dame tu frío y tu pan, dame tu mano hecha a puño y no necesito más. Esta es la hora primera, este es el justo lugar, con tu mano y con mi mano, hermano, empecemos ya. Sigue adelante, hermano, en esta hora primera, y apretada tu bandera, poniendo en alto la mano, y apretada tu bandera, en esta hora primera, en que el puño americano levanta el rostro al tirano y el dolor se queda fuera. Éntrale a la marcha, éntrale al tambor, éntrale que traigo pueblo en mi voz. Éntrale a la marcha, éntrale al tambor, éntrale que viene la revolución. Éntrale a la marcha, éntrale al tambor, éntrale que traigo pueblo en mi voz. ¿Algunos de ustedes se recuerdan? Eso.
In my life, I've also learned with the grandparents, with the comrades in my hometown.
Also with ancestors, with grandfathers, grandmas, I learned in my life that keeping our tradition, keeping our culture, practicing it, is a way of resisting. It's a way of struggling. And my people have been resisting and struggling more than 500 years. And I want to tell you honestly that my brothers and sisters back in Guatemala now deserve more those applauses that you're giving to me than me. So please give them a round of applause. I was born over there in the high lands of the Cochumatans in Guatemala, and the mountains very cold, and a very small town. It's called Jacaltenango. That's what the Spanish call Jacaltenango, but the real name is Xajla. People Mayan Cojtí. And I was born there, and the traditional music goes all and on and on. So I'm going to sing this last song just to say goodbye, or not goodbye, but my last song. And it's a traditional song from Jacaltenango. They name it Indio Jacaltenango. Voy a cantar en este son a mi pueblo Jacaltenango, tierra linda entre flores, flores lindas del río Sur. Tierra linda entre flores, flores lindas del río Sur. En el cerro, en un mulhuí, divisa Jacaltenango con sus calles empedradas, pueblo antiguo de Xajla. Con sus calles empedradas, pueblo antiguo de Xajla. En la placita de la Cruz se oye sonar la marimba, los hombres y las mujeres muy contentos bailan el sol. Los hombres y las mujeres muy contentos bailan el sol. Las mujeres usan huipil y sus cortes de pura lana, llevan cinta para el pelo que ellas mismas saben tejer. Usan cinta para el pelo que ellas mismas saben tejer. Los hombres usan capillay, sus calzones de pura manta, llevan faja en la cintura, usan caites para viajar. Llevan faja en la cintura, usan caites para viajar. Es mi orgullo decirlo así, porque soy puro jacalteco. Adiós les digo a mis amigos, adiós pueblo de Xajla. Adiós le digo a mis amigos, adiós pueblo de Xajla. Muchas gracias. Y arriba Guatemala.
Thank you so much, Pedro Montejo. And now we will have Marco Fonseca. He's an instructor in the Department of International Studies, Glendon College, York University, teaching courses on theories of international studies, Latin American politics, indigenous peoples, and international relations, and the theory of civil society. While writing his PhD dissertation in London, England, in the late 90s, Fonseca also held a part-time position as a lecturer at the Middlesex University, where he taught courses on the political and economic history of Latin America, born and raised in Guatemala City. Welcome, Marco.
That sounds more ostentatious than it actually is. It's just an instructor in Latin American studies. But after listening to this guy spin, what can you say? What can you do? Very little. It's all been said and done. But you said something. I'm reading this sign, and also you said something that I wasn't going to mention, but I will. What the hell? My mother was born in Tacisco.
Oh, wow.
And she was the daughter of Juan Jose Arévalo's cousin.
Wow.
So Juan Jose Arévalo is actually my great uncle.
Wow.
And Arévalo, the current president-elect, and I had a very lengthy conversation about family relations on several occasions. There's a book that Juan Jose Arévalo wrote. It's called Memorias de Aldea, or Memories of the Village. And in that book that Arévalo wrote, which is pretty an amazing memory of Arévalo's years in Tacisco, there's a picture of my grandmother that he describes. He describes the way she used to dress, and the way she used to paint her lips, and the way she used to ride into town on horseback. This is way back in the 1930s, even earlier actually, in the 1920s. So my mom grew up right next to Juan Jose Arévalo's house in Tacisco. And if it had not been for my grandmother, who of course wanted my mother to grow up in Guatemala City, to marry, to become a housewife, and to do all kinds of things, she would have been Guatemala's ambassador in Switzerland.
Wow.
And I would have grown up somewhere else. Certainly, I would have not come to Canada as a refugee in 1985, like a lot of Guatemalans here came. I left the country as I was part of the student movement in the 1980s in Guatemala. Well, the 1980s were not a very hospitable decade to live in Guatemala. We were under dictatorship. The university student unions at San Carlos University was particularly targeted for repression. Those were not very good years. So I had to leave the country in 1985 and come to Canada, where we've been active doing solidarity work with everybody who is pretty much in this room from Guatemala since then. It's quite an amazing experience we've had. I'll tell you this, if you ask every single Guatemalan in this room if the October Revolution means anything to them, every single one is going to tell you a story of what it means, right? What it means to us. And the memories that we have, either because some of us are old enough and maybe lived through those years. I don't know if Tata Bartolo did it. No sé si tú viviste la revolución. Of course.
Él es de la aldea El Pumpo.
El Pumpo, right? Well, an aldea I used to visit when I was a little kid as well. So everybody has a story of the October Revolution. And I have a story of the October. I didn't live the October Revolution. I'm too young, believe it or not. But I didn't live the October Revolution. My parents did. And what they lived was extraordinary. In June of 1944, something in Guatemala nobody foresaw. This is important to say. The October Revolution of 1944 was not forecast by anyone. If you read the papers in Guatemala in the 1940s, nobody would have predicted that in June of 1944 there was going to be a revolution. It was kind of like today. Like if you go back to June of this year, just before June 25th, when the first round of elections took place in Guatemala, and asked anybody, do you think there's going to be a revolution in Guatemala? Do you think there's going to be a second spring in Guatemala this year? Everybody would have told you, no way. No way. Semilla, the party that won the elections, was all in 7th place. There's no way that we're going to win the elections. 1944, same thing. In June of 1944, nobody would have said there's going to be a revolution in Guatemala. But then Ubico, the dictator of that day, kind of like Yamate today, Ubico did something not very smart. He looks at the University of San Carlos. There's a revolt breeding at the University of San Carlos, like always. Maybe not today, but back then. And back then, Ubico says, there's a bunch of Nazis, he called them Nazi fascists. I have no idea where he got the label from, but that's what he called the university students at San Carlos in 44. And so he decreed a state of siege in June of 1944. And a group of Guatemalans 311 of them wrote a letter. It's known as El Memorial de los 311. So they wrote a letter to Ubico, and they said, we want the restoration of constitutional rights, we want the restoration of constitutional freedoms, and we want that immediately. Ubico obviously didn't agree with this. Like Chamate, not agreeing to fire Consuelo Porras. So what happened? In June of 1944, there was a general strike in Guatemala, something not seen in the country since the 1920s. So for decades, there was no uprising. Ubico was an iron-clad dictator. It was the most brutal of the last dictators that ruled Guatemala since the late 19th century. He ruled for 13 years. The stories about him are crazy. Some are good, some are bad. My parents used to tell me, you know, under Ubico you could leave your doors unlocked. Nobody would go into your house. That was the good thing about him. The bad thing about him is he was a brutal dictator who favored foreign interests, including, of course, the interests of transnational corporations like the United Fruit Company. But in June 44, the people of Guatemala rose up. A general strike like the country had not seen since 1920, when the first Communist Party of the country was founded in 1920. And as a result of that, Ubico eventually left power. He was overthrown by a popular uprising. He left the country, went to the US, eventually died in New Orleans. The thing is, my point is, nobody saw the revolution of 1944 come. It was an unannounced thing. But when it came, it transformed the country. And two presidents got elected, as you may know, may not know. Arévalo, Juan José Arévalo, the father of Bernardo Arévalo, the current president-elect in the country, which is a whole story in its own right. So Arévalo gets elected in 1944, becomes president, 1945. A new constitution gets promulgated, gets issued in 1945. It's the first modern refoundation of Guatemala. It gave the country its most enduring and important social, political, and economic institutions of the 20th century. The country's social security system was then instituted. Arévalo was an educator. He was interested in education. What did he do? He created the school's normal system, a high school system for everybody, public schools for free. He created 6,000 schools in 4 years. 6,000 public schools in 4 years. Chamate, at the beginning of his term, promised 3 hospitals. He said he had to build 1. Not 1 hospital in the country. So Arévalo is remembered in Guatemala by Guatemalans as a great social reformer. He might have not been a communist or a socialist or anything like that. He spoke about something he called spiritual socialism, which was a kind of a way to talk about educating people to emancipate themselves. That was Arévalo. Arévalo was an institutional reformer, and he did it very well. And Guatemalans remember him fondly, which is why when everybody talks about Arévalo, it just brings warm memories. That's for sure. And then comes Arbenz in 1950. This is no ordinary reformer. Arbenz is an army officer, but is of one of a kind, a nationalist, a social, progressive army member. He's very aware of the country's needs, the country's plight, the plight of indigenous peoples in Guatemala. He's very aware of this. And most important of all, Arbenz is aware that if you do not touch the structures of the country, it's not just a matter of building new institutions. That's good. But you got to go beyond that, Arbenz thought. You have to touch the structures. And above all, you have to touch one. That's the one that if you touch, you're going to make a difference. Land. Land was the thing. And that was the one that was important because most people in Guatemala, indigenous peoples, most of them have been expropriated of land. The land had been concentrated in just a handful of very rich families, very small number. And also, of course, we all know the story of the United Fruit Company, an American company working in Guatemala, growing bananas and exporting bananas out of the Atlantic port of Puerto Barrios. El Estor, a little tiny town in Izabal, was known as El Estor because, well, Graham can probably tell us the story very well. El Estor is effectively the Spanish name for the store, which was Circa's store in Guatemala going to the Atlantic port. Point is, Arbenz says, we have to do something about the land. He passes one decree, Decree 900. That's the land reform decree in Guatemala. He passes it in 1952. The idea is to take land from companies like the United Fruit Company and give it to peasants in Guatemala. That's the idea. And how is he going to do this? Is he just going to be like a dictator who is going to go and send troops into the lands of the United Fruit Company and grab them and begin killing the owners? Not at all. The guy was a Democrat. Not only that, he was more than that. He was very plugged into international stuff. So, whose advice did Arbenz take to carry out his agrarian reform? The World Bank. Of all institutions, he goes to the World Bank and says, how do you think we should do the agrarian reform thing in Guatemala? So they tell him, you should do it this way. This is probably one of the most democratic ways to do it. In addition, Arbenz hired an economist from Saskatchewan, a Canadian economist, who was advising Arbenz on how to do an agrarian reform in Guatemala. And all of them said, here's the best way to do agrarian reform in Guatemala. Go and buy the land from companies like the United Fruit Company and pay them the price of the land. He said, that doesn't sound unreasonable. And how do I determine the price of the land? Very simple. Based on taxes. They declare their taxes. And on their taxes, they tell you what the land is worth. Arbenz said, that's not a bad idea. I'm going to do that. This is supposed to be communism, right? So he goes and takes the tax declarations of companies like the United Fruit Company and says, your land is worth, and I'm going to give you just a symbolic figure, $1 per acre. United Fruit Company cries foul and says, no way, it's $100 per acre if you want to buy it from us. Arbenz said, no, this is what you've been declaring for decades, and that's what you're going to get. You can't switch it on me. You can't do a switcheroo of prices at the very end. It's now, that's what you've been saying, that's what it's worth, that's what you get. The price of doing this is a coup d'etat organized by the CIA against Arbenz because the big, the CEO of the United Fruit Company was the brother of the CIA director at the time. So they all organized a little coup. They overthrew Arbenz in 1954. And as a consequence of that, from 1954 to 1985, Guatemala was ruled by military dictatorships. One more brutal than the one before. And by the time we get to the 1980s, the military dictatorships are out of control. We all have heard of this, the genocide of the early 1980s, late 1970s, when Rios Montt was in power, one of the most brutal, one of the last and most brutal dictators in the country. Committed suicide against indigenous peoples. It's something we remember as a consequence, not only of the internal armed conflict in Guatemala, but we also remember it as a consequence of the failure of the coup d'etat of 1954. For us, it goes back to that. It goes back to the Guatemalan Spring that was effectively cut short, was effectively undermined by anti-communist forces in the country. But I want to reiterate that when we look back to 1944, this incredible, precious flower, as is called sometimes by writers, of the Guatemalan Spring, was something nobody anticipated. Let me fast forward now to 2023. Let's go back to June of this year, June 25th, rather. Every poll in the country, every single one, was saying that the winner of the election was going to be one of three candidates. All of them right-wing candidates. All of them. Okay? Those were the candidates that were essentially approved, not only to become the potential winners of the elections of 2023, but also the ones that the Supreme Electoral Tribunal of the country, the TSE, had effectively ensured that they were going to run, that they were going to eventually win the elections, one of them was going to continue the policies initiated in 2016. And I'll explain what that is in short. Nobody saw the party polling in 7th place, which is called the Semilla Party, the seed party, party of President Arévalo elect. Nobody saw that party coming to win the elections. And why not? Let me tell you why. At least this is what I think. No poll done in Guatemala in 2023 ever asked the people who they were polling, not poll, from anybody, from Prensa Libre, from Gallup, nobody asked Guatemalans, are you still somehow pissed off by corruption in the country? You read the questions they asked the people, that's not one of them. It should have been a question. If I'd been a pollster, I would have put a question there. Maybe the first question to ask the Guatemalan people, thank you, the question would have been, are you still mad? Are you still angry at the levels of corruption in the country? They didn't ask this question. And the reason they didn't ask this question is because the whole idea of the 2023 elections was to put 2015 behind Guatemala. 2015 was a threat. Nobody saw 2015 coming, like June 1944. 2015 was completely a surprise, especially on the elites in Guatemala. But what happened in 2015? The commission, the United Nations Commission Against Impunity in the country, put out a report in 2015 that effectively shook the foundations of the Guatemalan political and economic establishment. How so? The CICIG, as it is called, led by Ivan Velázquez, a Colombian lawyer, very well-known lawyer, was working in Guatemala for a number of years doing investigations into corruption, impunity, illegal bodies, clandestine bodies, and so on. In 2015, they put out a report. The report revealed that the number one problem with Guatemalan democracy, as the report said, was illicit campaign financing. And it wasn't just any illicit campaign financing. It wasn't just like $5 over here, $5 over there. This was massive buyout of politicians, massive buyout of state policies, state decisions, government decisions favoring what is known in Guatemala as the G8. The G8 is the code name for a group of 8 very powerful economic families in Guatemala whose lineage goes all the way back to wherever, I don't know, Adam and Eve. That's what they like to say. That's what they like to think. So, illicit campaign financing, CICIG said, is, quote, the cardinal capital of Guatemalan democracy. This was outrageous to people. When people read the report, you see, one thing is to know about this, like when we all Guatemalans talk about how corrupt the country is, and we all talk about rumors, and did you hear about this, and you hear about that. Everybody's talking like this. Every once in a while, you get a newspaper article saying, you know, when there's a lot of, there's rumors that this is happening. Or we all have these stories that we all tell each other. This time, 2015, was a UN commission putting out a report essentially revealing the unbelievably high levels of corruption that existed in the country. And at that time, the worst and most corrupt of all regimes we've had in Guatemala in decades, the government of Otto Pérez Molina, leader of the Popular Party of Guatemala, the PP. He was the one that implemented a policy that became known as La Línea, the line. Simple policy. Put your own people in control of the custom unions in Guatemala, the custom, border control in Guatemala, and siphon out as much money as you can out of imports and exports in the country. This was millions and millions and millions of dollars that didn't go into the state's coffers. They went into private hands. CICIG put the report out, And within weeks of the CC report, there is a massive uprising in the country. An uprising in the country that the likes of which we've not seen again in decades. We've not seen this. The uprising in Guatemala in 2015 lasted about 2 weeks. That's about it, 2 weeks. But within 2 weeks, the government of Otto Pérez Molina had collapsed. His government is the first government to collapse in Guatemala since the Serrano Elias government in 1992. So a long time. Otto Pérez Molina government collapses, and as a consequence of that, you get an interim government. And then in 2016, you get a clown elected president of the country. That's Jimmy Morales. Literally, he was a clown who ran for president, called himself an outsider, won the election somehow because, well, he's financed by the private sector. And then in 2019, an ex-jail warden wins the elections. That's Yamate, and he's been in power since 2020. What I'm trying to say is that in 2015, Guatemalans rose up, overthrew a government, the government of Otto Pérez Molina. As a consequence of that uprising, the Guatemalan elites responded by putting in place two very, very right-wing governments that instead of rolling corruption back in the country, have actually deepened it, have actually made it worse. But what 2015 means for many of us is the following. Semilla Party, the party of President-elect Bernardo Arévalo, came out of the protests of 2015. The young people that have become organizers of Semilla, like for instance Semilla's president, a young man known, his name is Samuel Perez. He was protesting in Guatemala City in 2015. He was part of that wave of young people who rose up in protest in 2015 and overthrew the government of Otto Pérez Molina. So, here's the thing. In January of this year, the Guatemala's election tribunal was making absolutely sure that a fraud was going to take place, an election fraud. How so? They excluded one of the most left-leaning political parties the country has had in a very long time. It's called the MLP Party, Movimiento para la Liberación de los Pueblos. This party was running with a presidential candidate of indigenous background, Telma Cabrera. Telma Cabrera was the presidential candidate of MLP. Next to her companion for the vice presidency of the country was Jordan Rodas. Jordan Rodas was the human rights ombudsman of the country for the previous 5 years or 4 years. And Jordan Rodas became known for being a thorn on the side of the Morales government and the Yamate government, denouncing corruption, calling on them to do the right thing. When the pandemic was unfolding in Guatemala between 2020 and 2023, one of the worst things President Yamate did was to give a speech in June 2020, kind of an unbelievable speech. He stood on national television and he told Guatemalans, we've got a pandemic going, it's going to be terrible, everybody has to be prepared for this, help yourselves. That's what he said. I'm not issuing a mandate on masks, I'm not going to issue a mandate on health measures, I'm not going to issue anything. Like he was an advocate of freedom, so to speak. So he told people, sálvese quien pueda. That was in 2020. So that was Yamate dealing with the pandemic. Since then, his government has been involved in a series of corruption scandals. The latest one of which you may know is called the Alfombra Mágica corruption scandal. It's a simple one, very simple actually. A group of investors, and this is just by way of illustrating how corrupt the governments have been since 2015. despite the fact that in 2015, the people rose up against them and overthrew the government of Otto Pérez Molina. But in 2022, 2021, beginning then, a group of investors goes to Guatemala because they know this is how things work in the country. So a group of Ukrainian and Russian investors go to Guatemala. They want to invest a large chunk of cash. They want to lease a piece of land in one of the Pacific ports of the country, but they don't want to go through all the red tape. They don't want to go through all the checks, to all the studies, to get the approvals, to get the permits. They don't want any of this. They want expedited, express approval for their little investment in the Pacific port known as Puerto Quetzal. So how do you do this in a country like Guatemala with corrupt presidents? Very simple. You stash a whole bunch of money into a carpet. Then you roll it up, literally. Then you go visit the president to the presidential palace. You go, you knock on the door, and you offer this gift, which is exactly, or is reportedly to have happened in the case of Yamate. So these investors, Ukrainian and Russian investors, go to the presidential palace with an alfombra mágica, a magic carpet, rolled up, stashed with money, and that's the way you get your permits expedited. The guy who revealed this was published in the New York Times. And then in Guatemala, this was revealed by a special prosecutor, one of the very last honest, one of the very last dedicated prosecutors that used to work for CSIG before 2018. He used to work for CSIG, and he was still working in Guatemala in 2022. He revealed this case. He said, I'm going to investigate this case. Okay? 2 months later, he's out of the country. He's now in exile in Washington. Not alone. He's in exile in Washington with practically every single other member of the former Commission Against Impunity, CSIG, prosecutors, lawyers, you name it. They're all exiled in Washington as we speak, awaiting return, awaiting Arévalo to take power. So the point is, 2015 is the year that nobody expected was going to happen in Guatemala, but did. Overthrew one government, very important. But the legacy that it left is what matters to me. That's what is the root of the current Guatemalan Spring. That's where it's based. 2015 saw young people rise up in Guatemala like never before. Like really, since we used to throw stones and bricks at buses in the 1970s when we were protesting the dictatorship in Guatemala. I remember doing this. I remember I was a high school student in La Escuela Normal in Guatemala City. And I remember 1978 especially, when there was a huge protest in Guatemala City against buses, against the rise in bus fares. So what did we do? We took to the streets, we burned buses, and we resisted the police and fought against the riot cops. And I remember me being, 13 years old, I recall tossing bricks and stones, kind of like Palestinian style intifada in Guatemala, 1978. So, 2015 is when young people rose up. Out of that, you get Semilla Party. Out of that, you get Arévalo, and you get this president-elect. So, not expected. What happened again, just to recap, 2023 was the year when the return of an Arévalo took place in Guatemala. But it wasn't expected. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was planned and programmed exactly so that it wouldn't happen. The Supreme Electoral Tribunal selected the political parties that were going to win. And what happened on June 25th is that it backfired. It didn't work. They were not expecting a collapse of the vote for the extreme right-wing parties. Not expecting this at all. But not only that, they excluded every other candidate that they didn't like. They excluded Jordan Rodas Antel Maldana, they excluded Roberto Arzu, and they excluded Carlos Pineda. These were also right-wing candidates, but they were populists. They were against the elite, against the establishment. So they were not very well liked. So they needed to be excluded, which is what the election tribunal did. They excluded every single candidate they did not like, except Arévalo. And the reason they didn't exclude Arévalo is not because they were not afraid of him. No, it's just that he didn't pose a threat. Nobody in Guatemala knew practically who Bernardo Arévalo was before June 2023. Nobody knew who the guy was. He was polling 7th place. Really, Semilla was a completely unknown quantity. And then the surprise came. June 25th, Semilla wins the elections. And what happens is that a campaign of legal war, what is called lawfare, became intensified in the country. Lawfare meaning the public ministry led by Consuelo Porras, this infamous woman we all hate passionately. Consuelo Porras, she is essentially the country's attorney general. She's the one that has been essentially prosecuting every former member of CICIG. She's been prosecuting activists. She's been prosecuting opposition members, dissenters, journalists like Jose Ruben Zamora, who is now languishing in prison and will be there for I don't know how many more years, 5 more years. His trial was just his verdict was just canceled, but we are expecting him to rot in jail for a few more years. So Consuelo Porras unleashed a campaign of legal war against the results of the elections of June 20th. If it had been up to her, the second round of elections on August the 20th wouldn't have taken place. She would have made sure that that gets canceled. But the Constitutional Court in Guatemala, in a surprise ruling, said the results of June 25th stand, the second round will take place. And again, for the second round, they were hoping that Sandra Torres was going to win the elections. She was the last hope of the corrupt political parties. For the third time, Sandra Torres was running for the presidency of the country. And for the third time, Guatemalans told Sandra Torres, no te toca. It's not your time. It's not your time. Right? And unexpectedly, Bernardo Arévalo got more than 2 million votes on August 20th, which is again very, very, very significant. It's not as big, surprisingly enough, as the votes that Morales got in 2015, but it's very significant. It's a very significant number of votes. And so what we are witnessing right now in Guatemala, why we are here, is because Consuelo Porras has been waging this war, this legal war against the results of the elections. Her aim is to essentially cancel the elections if she can. She's been trying by every means at her disposal to try and somehow override the vote of the people. And what outraged everybody, especially indigenous communities, 20 days ago, 19 days of a national strike now. But what outraged indigenous peoples especially was the fact that Consuelo Porras decided to do something which is never done in Guatemala. I don't think it's ever done anywhere in the world, really. It's the equivalent of Guatemala's January the 6th. Only in Guatemala, she actually pulled it off so far, whereas in the US they stopped it. So what did she do? She goes right into the very offices of the Guatemalan Election Tribunal, literally. She takes her goons, cops, heavily armed. They go into the offices of the Election Tribunal, and they pull out the boxes that contain the votes of the people. The boxes themselves. The Constitutional Court in the country had ruled back in September. The Constitutional Court had ruled that it was okay to do a recount only of the registry of the votes. The sheets that have the tally of the votes. That's what you can do, because that's not boxed in, that's not sealed. But the actual boxes that contain the votes of the people, it's like sacred stuff, that's sealed and stored away. And there's only one authority by constitutional mandate that can do anything with those boxes, essentially store them for good. That's the election tribunal. Consuelo Porras got an order from a judge, a very corrupt judge. His name is Orellana. This judge put out a ruling saying, Consuelo Porras, you can go into the election tribunal office, pull out the boxes, and count the votes yourself. When this happened, indigenous peoples in Guatemala said, that's it. That's it, suckers. We are going for you. And 19 days ago, they called 48 Cantones, is the organization led by indigenous peoples, 48 hamlets. 48 Cantones called for a national strike, right? Un paro nacional to take place, indefinitely. And that is what is going on. So we have 19 days today, on October the 20th, 19 days of a national strike, the likes of which and the numbers of which we've not seen in the country, frankly, ever. Not even in 44, 54. This is unprecedented. And so everybody in Guatemala is calling for Consuelo Porras to resign. Everybody in Guatemala is calling for the corrupt judges that she's working with, like Orellana, to resign. Everybody's telling the president, who, for constitutional reasons, does not have the authority to fire the attorney general. Because of a reform that was implemented in 2016, he cannot fire the attorney general. And that was his press conference a few days ago. You're asking me to do something I cannot do. So indigenous peoples have told him, okay, you can't fire this person, at least say it in public. Quit, resign. But he's not going to do this. And the reason why Yamate is not calling on Consuelo Porras to resign, the woman who wants to effectively hijack the elections, the woman who wants to cancel the people's vote, the woman who wants to get rid of Arévalo as the president-elect. This is big. This is a big deal. The reason why Yamate is not calling on her to submit her resignation is because she knows too much about his corruption scandals. She knows about Alfombra Mágica, that little visit that Ukrainians and Russians pay to the president. She knows that she's got him. He can ask for resignation. So this woman, as we speak, is the one woman around whom the entire country is rallying, demanding her resignation. And she's not doing it. It seems actually as if she's the one calling the shots in the country at this point. Not even the president. It seems as if Consuelo Porras is the one doing this. Now, what gives me hope to end this with, what gives me hope is, the fact that Guatemalans have shown that when you least expect them to do something extraordinary, that's when they pull it off. When you say, wow, look at Guatemalans, they're organized, fighting the good fight. I love the poetry, but in Guatemala we fought a 30-year civil war. Yep. We went to hell and back. We didn't win very much. It was a genocide. It was a terrible thing. We had 250,000 people dead, 440 villages wiped out of the country. That was a terrible thing, terrible. And what it did is it just hardened the Guatemalan elites. It just made them worse, made them more brutal, more savage. Didn't lead very much. We signed the peace agreements in '96. We were all singing, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido in 1996. The peace agreements now are, we say it in Spanish, no son acuerdos de paz, son recuerdos de paz. Just remember them now as peace agreements. They led to nothing. And Guatemalans sometimes can also be very puzzling in the kinds of things we do. In 1999, there was a constitutional referendum to see if Guatemalans wanted the peace agreements to become law. Guatemalans said no. No to the peace agreements, which was profoundly disappointing. So, the wisdom of the people is sometimes a little fickle. You don't know which way it's going to go. But right now, we have a movement in Guatemala, 18, 19 days going strong, a national strike. And it's all because Guatemalans are now convinced more than ever that a second spring is possible, that another Guatemala is possible, that Arévalo will live up to his promises. And he has promised not only to get rid of corruption, he has also promised to live up to the image of his own father. He says, I am under the shadow of my father. I'm not my father, but I'm under his shadow. And this is something that I intend to live up to. And that, I think, is what gives us hope. Now, whether he's going to be able to take power on January the 14th, we can only hope. We can only speculate, because Consuelo Porras is not going anywhere. But I don't want to end on a sour note. I want to end on a good note. Today, Arévalo went to the streets outside the public ministry in Guatemala. Right? He gave a speech to indigenous peoples, Arévalo. He said, we wouldn't be here today where we are if it were not for the fight and the struggle and the persistence of indigenous peoples in the country. If this is going to go anywhere, it's because you are fighting for it. And I think that that's what we need to call on everybody to do. To fight for this election, to defend the election results, to defend the presidency of Arévalo, to make sure that as of January the 14th, 2024, we are indeed going to have a second Guatemala Spring. Thank you.
Now we have a period of questions and answers that Marco will be handling. Yes.
I'm told that they're circulating this little sheet, a solidarity letter suggestion for actions you can undertake, for possible follow-ups. As I understand it, the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala has taken the stand that the election results need to be respected. And they've largely done that because the US is doing that. I think that if the US were quiet on this, the Canadian Embassy would also be quiet on this. But the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala is saying the election results need to stand, they need to be respected. And so they are rallying together with some European countries, the US, of course, and so on. And the US has been particularly active in saying the results must be respected, the transition has to take place, this is something that cannot be changed, and so on. So pressing our MPs, if we can contact our own MPs and tell them to continue to put pressure on the Canadian government to ensure that the election results in Guatemala are going to be respected, that's very important. We need to make our voices heard from our MPs so that they can transfer this to the Canadian government, so this can go to the embassy, so they can continue to put pressure on the Guatemalan authorities as well. Well, if you're not following the Bernardo Arévalo TikTok channel, I would suggest you do. They post on the TikTok channel, the Bernardo Arévalo TikTok channel, constant updates on every single one of his public interventions, every one of them. I would suggest you follow them as well. I would also suggest that you follow 48 Cantones on Twitter. They have a Twitter handle, and it's called 48 Cantones Oficial. I would suggest that you do that on Twitter. And then see who is following 48 Cantones, and it goes from there.
Beautiful, thank you.
Bernardo Arévalo is looking very carefully at the different examples of governance around Guatemala. He's looking at the example of Bukele, and it gives Bernardo goosebumps. when he sees the Bukele example, he's saying, this is not something we are going to do in Guatemala. He's actually said that. We're not gonna follow the Bukele model at all. Like Xiomara Castro in Honduras tried to do, but not very successfully and not very well, haphazardly, badly actually. So he's already met AMLO, the president of Mexico. A tiny little encounter on one of Arévalo's 2 foreign trips so far. He went to Mexico, he went to the town of Puebla for a little meeting just a couple of weeks ago, and he very briefly met AMLO, the Mexican president, in Mexico, and AMLO embraced him. AMLO said, you know, about time we get the return of an Arévalo in Guatemala. So AMLO was very enthusiastic about the Arévalo election. I don't think that's the position of Ortega in Nicaragua. The Ortega dictatorship in Nicaragua is a monster, something else. So I don't think they're very happy about this. And they're not happy about it because Arévalo is openly speaking a social democrat. He's not in any way at all some, you know, old guard revolutionary. He's a social democrat, a decent, like his father. He's like very much like his father. So he sees Ortega and he's frightened by what he sees. Now, he has received messages of encouragement from people like Boric in Chile, from Lula in Brazil, and someone who has actually tweeted openly in support of Arévalo is Petro of Colombia. So progressive presidents in Latin America are lining up behind Arévalo. Some of the more questionable ones, especially the candidates like Milei in Argentina, I don't think they would look at Arévalo with a lot of enthusiasm. And that's because Arévalo is promising an explicitly interventionist state. He wants the state to be involved. He wants state policy to be involved. He wants money to be spent on social programs in a big way. He's asking for a massive increase in the public budget. I don't know how Guatemalans were going to pay for that, but he's asking for a massive boost in the public budget by 10 extra billion quetzales. That's about $2 extra billion. May not seem like a lot in the US or here, but down there, it's a lot of money. And he wants to earmark all of this, not only for infrastructure projects, but also for social programs. So progressive presidents throughout Latin America are looking at Arévalo with a lot of emotion. And perhaps the former president has reacted the most emotionally to the election of Arévalo is Mujica, the former president of Uruguay. And that's because Arévalo was born in Uruguay, right? Because his father, Arévalo, was working in Uruguay for about 10 years, and where he met his wife. And Arévalo had more than one wife. Arévalo's Bernardo's mother. So he was born in Uruguay. So when Mujica speaks of Arévalo, speaks with him very warmly, as if it's our Uruguayan that's being elected in Guatemala, sort of thing. So there is that kinship among them. So very progressive people are reacting positively to this. And I gotta tell you, and I have to be honest about this, I'm somewhat surprised by the extent to which even the US has decided to support the results and the candidacy of Arévalo. It's a little surprising. I'd like to see what's going on underneath here. Needless to say, Arévalo's trip, his first major foreign trip, before even assuming power, was to Washington, to meet people in Washington. So that may be a good sign. I don't know what kind of a sign it is, but they are very much aligned and supporting Arévalo. So I think that's where things are. He's asking the question of how surprising it is to have the OAS, the Organization of American States, also, kind of supporting the election of Arévalo in light of the attacks that it's under. I don't think it's because Almagro is a Democrat. I think it's Luis Almagro, the head of the OAS, has a long. I mean, he's only been there for 4 years. His mandate is coming up for renewal, not renewal, whatever, in 1 more year. But Almagro has very much taken the side of right-wing governments in Latin America since he came to the head of the OAS. I think Almagro would not be as involved in what's going on in Guatemala if the State Department of the US were not telling him to get involved and say something about what's going on in Guatemala. That's my honest opinion. I think Almagro would probably be turning a blind eye to attempts to derail the election in Guatemala, because when he went to Guatemala, they showed him evidence of the coup, evidence of the fraud. That's what they called it. And at that moment, he didn't say anything. He left the country, didn't say, you know what, you're showing me this, but I don't believe a word. This doesn't make any sense. He didn't say that. He left the country and then later on put out a report. So yes, the OAS is right now supporting the election and supporting the transition to Arévalo. This is true, but I think it's because, I repeat, because of pressure from the State Department. Okay.
Thank you so much, Marco. And I feel bad that I didn't announce at the beginning of the presentation that there will be a test for everybody tonight. And if you win the test, then Marco will provide you with a free ticket to Guatemala. Okay. I just want to welcome Señor Demetrio Cojtí. He's a Cachiquel Maya intellectual scholar and writer who has focused on political and cultural rights. He is regarded as the most important leader of the political and cultural trends of the Maya movement. Academically, Cojtí has a doctorate degree in social communication from the Universidad Católica de Lovaina in Belgium and a master's degree in development from the Universidad del Valle in Guatemala. If everybody agrees, I think we were not, we didn't know you were coming, but we're very, very pleased to know that you're here. So welcome. If you would like to come and give us some words, a message, that would be wonderful. Thank you for being here. Well done.
My English is not good, that's why I will going to speak in Spanish.
Thank you very much for this interest in Guatemala. Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the ones who are going forward of interest in supporting and protesting and standing in solidarity. Just a few words because they are offering a snack. First of all, it had never happened in Guatemala. The social movement like this, with this density of people mobilizing. And it has never happened in the Guatemalan history that rural indigenous communities moving to the Guatemalan capital, to the Guatemala city, from Izabal, from San Marcos, moving all the way up to Guatemala city on caravans, spontaneously organized by people to reinforce the ones who have taken or who are protesting in front of the headquarters of the public ministry in Guatemala city. That's the first fact. And the second fact is that it had never happened. The unity with indigenous, with non-indigenous communities. That's something that is happening. It's very well known in Guatemala, the racism and discrimination against the indigenous people. It is one of the countries with more racist countries in Latin America against the Afro and indigenous communities. But right now, there is an unity, there is an alliance between, not between the elites and the mixed elites, but with the middle class of the mixed nations and the indigenous people, there is an alliance. And what we hear, the tendency, there is a first positive effects of this mobilization of 19 days. And the first effect of this, it is the articulation of all the peoples in Guatemala, all the nations, that means indigenous and non-indigenous, and the articulation among indigenous nations also, because it is a way of unite all the demands to demand a better future for the whole country. The winning of Semilla, it's what made the movement stronger. And one positive result or effect of partially but in process is that the Guatemalan people, us as Guatemalans, are demanding respect in front of the government and in front of the corrupt pact, the so-called corrupt pact. People is not gonna let themselves, people is not gonna let to the result of the elections to be stolen. Those are the three results, the positive results that this mobilization is taking place. Thank you so much for your interest, and thank you so much also for your support to Guatemala. I know that Guatemala is there, the Canadian embassy, and we know that many Canadian mining companies are there with capital, with Canadian capital. There is a problem because some of them have continue with the mining projects, with the natural resources projects, and working in alliance with this corrupt pact and this corrupt government. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, we have Pedro Montejo and his family. On January 8/21, Pedro Montejo and his family arrived in Canada. Pedro is a teacher, researcher, and advocate of indigenous people and indigenous issues. Since he has been working with the Mayan communities in Guatemala for many years, he hopes to continue that collaboration alongside making connections with indigenous communities in Canada. Our most traditional musical instrument, the marimba, and he says you are also free to dance if you wish. Thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing with us on this very important topic for our country.